for the rest of our time together. We have 71 minutes, and here's what I'd like to accomplish in this time. I would like, first of all, to work through the great books reading list in about 10 minutes, 15 minutes with you. Then I'd like to introduce you, I'd like to talk about the way that we're going to be doing history in this class, and that will certainly take up the rest of our time. So, this isn't directly related to the syllabus, but these books that I'm going to be talking about are found on your syllabus from the section of the Great Book Reading List and the in and of itself kind of an overview of the class. We're going to be dealing with church history up to about the year 30 through these books, not in alphabetical list as in chronological order. In the next 10 minutes, we're going to get a super snapshot of where we're headed for the whole class. So that's why I indulge myself in talking through these books. Also, I want you to be able to make good decisions on the books that you're going to be choosing. So I want you to know at least something about the books before you actually go out and choose the books that you're going to be reviewing. So first of all, Livy is the earliest book on that Great Books reading list. Livy, he wrote this masterful, huge history of Rome from the founding of the city in 753 BC up to his own day. There were 142 books in this massive, massive history. Only 35 books of it survive, and only 5 books of the history actually are in that Penguin edition that you can read. It's item K under the historical sources of the syllabus, Livy, the Early History of Rome, books 1 through 5. It's a big book. It's a thick, Penguin, of course, always has nice small pages, but still it's a pretty thick book, and it's only the first 5 books of his history. Livy wrote 142 books, so the whole set, were it to exist today, would be many tens of thousands of pages. Just working through the book list in chronological order, Aristotle. You've heard of him all your life. If you've never read something of Aristotle, now's your chance. Aristotle lived about 384 to 322 BC. He was a student of Plato, the teacher of Alexander the Great, and his Nicomachean Ethics is on your book list for your consideration. He sets out to answer the question, what is the good? What is it? What is the good? Why is Aristotle so important for church historical purposes? Well, if I can paint in broad brush strokes, the early church fathers, say up to the year 500 about, really gravitated towards Plato. Many of them were Platonists. Justin Martyr and Clement of Alexandria, Augustine of Hippo were very outspoken Platonists, but Platonic philosophy and Neoplatonic philosophy influenced heavily the early ages of Christianity. Aristotle's influence came a little bit later with the medieval theologians. Even as early as Boethius in the 7th century AD, you can see a strong, a deep understanding and a strong interest in Aristotelian themes. And by the time we get to Thomas Aquinas and the other scholastics in the 1300s, rather 13th century and the late 1200s, they're through and through Aristotelian. So Aristotle is really important if you want to understand something of medieval theology, and especially if you want to understand scholastic theology. The Apostolic Fathers in English. So where is that on your book list? That is, thanks. It's item E under the theological book list. The Apostolic Fathers in English. What happens after the New Testament closes? Book of Revelation's over, you close the New Testament, you're done reading the New Testament. What happened in church history after that? The story picks up next with the Apostolic Fathers. They're the next piece of literature that we have, the next existing piece of literature after the 1st century and the apostles themselves. So we call them the Apostolic Fathers. And it's a hodgepodge, very fascinating reading, a little dense, not an easy read, but the edition that I have listed there by Michael Holmes is a not terribly expensive. It's like $30, something like that. But it's a bilingual edition, so although it looks fat, you only have to read one of those pages because the other page is Greek. Some of you might choose to read the Greek, but most of you will choose to read the English. So it's not actually that terribly thick. And this is there. It's a a set of figures, Clement of Rome, Polycarp, Ignatius of Antioch. There's a few figures whose literary remains are collected in that book, The Apostolic Fathers. If you want to know what happens after the New Testament closes, that book's for you. Okay, moving on to the 3rd century, 3rd and 4th century AD, we come to Eusebius of Caesarea. Eusebius of Caesarea, that's item E under the historical book list. And by the way, I'm doing this for your sakes, so I suggest checking here or there or making a note. If my little blurb sounds interesting to you and you want to follow up on that book, make a note in your syllabus so that you can, or online or however it is that you're looking on, so that you can know if this is a book that you'd like to write a review of or at least look at further as a suspect for a book that you'd like to review on. Eusebius, his church history, and it's titled, it's The History of the Church from Christ to Constantine. Again, it's a Penguin edition, a nice cheap book, but a lovely translation. Eusebius and his church history, were it not for this book, we would know very little about what happens in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Eusebius and his book here is a treasure trove of traditional information about the church up to the early 4th century. And literally, were it not for this book, the vast majority of our knowledge about those early 2nd, 3rd, and early 4th century would be lost. It's quite predictable. If you're looking through a biblical commentary, and let's say you're in the author introduction part of the commentary, and they're introducing to you John the Apostle or something like that, who wrote the Revelation or whatever, and they'll say according to church tradition X, Y, and Z. That according to church tradition for those early years almost always means Eusebius said it in his church history book. So we call him legitimately the father of church history. Athanasius. Let's see, his Life of St. Anthony. That's going to be under the historical sources. Thought. No. I'm sorry? Did you find it there? Is Life of St. Anthony not on this list? I'm sorry. Looks like Life of St. Anthony is not on this list, but it should be. Oh, excuse me. Thanks, Palmer. Thanks. So it's item B on the historical sources, the early Christian lives, and I assume that the Life of St. Anthony is in that collection. Anyway, the Life of St. Anthony, which I trust is item B. If it's not, you can read the Ancient Christian Writers. That's a series name, the Ancient Christian Writers. There's an edition of Athanasius's Life of St. Anthony. You can read that edition too if you want. Kevin, it's in there, you know. Thank you. Thank you. This is a gem of a book. The Life of St. Anthony. St. Anthony was one of the earlier Anchoritic monks. He was one of these Hermetic monks who went off into the desert to be alone and to meet God. And his life story, this Life of St. Anthony, was a bestseller in antiquity. It was part of the Augustine of Hippo, maybe a name that you know and certainly will know after this class. Augustine of Hippo, in his conversion story, he's wrestling with whether to become a Christian, and in Augustine's mind, that means whether he's going to become a monk. He's heard the story of St. Anthony and decides to follow St. Anthony's path and to become a monk or a Christian. This book has an amazing influence. It was truly a bestseller. One of the students who was in the PhD program where I was at Fordham University back a decade ago was studying. She was doing a redaction, critical edition, I should say, of this text, the Greek text of St. Anthony's life. And there was 400 manuscripts that she had to collate. Now, from an early date, 400 manuscripts is a phenomenal number of manuscripts. Yeah, there's 5,000 New Testament manuscripts, but if you look at other church historical sources, nothing holds a candle to that. Usually there's like 5 or 12 manuscripts, or in some cases there was, like in just one of the cases of something that Justin Martyr had written, we had only a single manuscript edition of it, and then it burns in 1878 in a manuscript fire in the University of Strasbourg. So some of these texts we don't even have original texts for anymore. So to have 400 manuscripts of an ancient text, that's just phenomenal. and reflects the fact that it was incredibly popular. So check out this Athanasius' Life of St. Antony in item B under the historical sources. That is one of the most powerful stories that catapults monasticism to the front acceptance, Christian cultural acceptance in the 4th century. Item K on the theological book list, again I'm just going through these chronologically, The Desert Fathers. It's a collection of spiritual wisdom of the earliest monks in the desert in Egypt. Jerome writes a book, this is under historical sources, this is under the first book list, on illustrious men. Of Caesarea's church history, in that it contains just this huge treasure trove of early Christian tradition. Jerome's style is much more systematic than Eusebius's. Eusebius's is, he lists out 135 early Christian authors and tells you about all the things that they wrote and their lives. It's a short book, so you can read it quickly, but it's pretty dense. But it is very short. John Chrysostom, are you thinking about becoming a pastor? John Chrysostom, in the late 4th century, I should say, in early 5th century, writes this text called On the Priesthood, and it's a set of instructions for what a priest should do and how a priest should order his life. On the priesthood. It is that the advice that late 4th and early 5th century, this book is 3 texts from Augustine on this book list, under the first 3 items there for the theological sources. I noticed today that this is out of alphabetical order because, of course, U comes after N, but I think it was actually subconscious. I wanted you to see Augustine first, because I think Augustine, and I'll expose my prejudice here, or actually I'll expose my conviction, that Augustine is the most important Christian theologian, period. I don't count Jesus as a theologian, and I don't count the apostles as theologians. They're something different. So outside of Jesus and the apostles, I think Augustine is the preeminent Christian theologian. Part of what I think bears out that conviction is, it seems to me that the Reformation, this terribly important event that took place about 500 years ago and still orients many of our theological discussions today as Protestants, the Reformation is largely an argument internally of the church about how to interpret Augustine and whether Augustine got it right. And we find that the Roman Catholics took one answer on that debate, and those who became known as Protestants took another answer on that debate. But I still think we're fighting about Augustine, not really Paul so much. We're fighting about Augustine's reading of Paul, if you will. So I think Augustine is just unbelievably important. I've got 3 books on this list from Augustine for your choosing. You can read his On Christian Teaching, in which he wrote this book as he was contemplating, actually he wrote it near the end of his life after he had spent a lifetime of preaching. But the book is really what we would call a manual of hermeneutics. It's his advice on how to study Scripture and how to teach Scripture. We have item B, his Confessions, in which, yes, he does confess his sins, but also confessions in the sense of a statement of praise to God. It's really an extended prayer of his praise to God. If none of these books look interesting to you, read the Confessions. The Confessions, it's just a masterpiece of early Christian literature. It's poignant, passionate, speaks to our hearts today. It's an amazing book. If you haven't read it, here's an opportunity to do so. Go ahead, please. He was writing in Latin. He did know some Greek. His Greek was probably not too much than our Greek today. Those of us working in the 3rd-year Greek seminar, I think, can read Greek about as well as Augustine could. He could read biblical Greek. He could read some things, but it was painstaking and took time. Yep. So he writes in Latin. And his mindset is thoroughly Roman educated. Was there another question? Good. I will answer, and then see if Pete will answer, because that's a perfect question for our chat room. Augustine dies in 430 AD, so dies in the early 5th century. Good. You can also read, as things get cold around here in Spokane, as they're bound to about November, you can read his sermons for Christmas and Epiphany. Epiphany is January the 6th, the Christian holiday commemorating when the wise men were meant to come and visit the baby Jesus. So sermons for that Christmastide season. Nice cozy reading with a cup of hot chocolate, a lit candle in your dorm room. Okay. Yeah, no, I love the fall for that reason. Okay, so that's Augustine. John Cassian, are you interested in monasticism? Or are you, I hope you are. Are you interested in early Christian community life? Let me try to sell it to you that way. John Cassian observes the Desert Fathers who are developing this new spiritual way of life and communicates that to the West. Theological sources. Where's Cassian? Yep, thank you. Item N, his conferences are going to be this collection of spiritual wisdom on community life. Boethius, a Christian theologian living from 480 to 524. He's a Christian philosopher. He's an aristocrat. He's born in Rome. And he joins the service of the Emperor Theodoric the Great in 506. He's suspected of spying and, in fact, is put to death for tragic life. At the end, he has this tragic death. He writes the text, The Consolation of Philosophy, which is this dialogue that he's having with Lady Wisdom as he's spending his last days in his jail cell before an impending death. And it's his praise of wisdom. It's also a brilliant book in that it shows the Christian appropriation of classical philosophy in this period immediately before the Middle Ages. So in the Middle Ages, we're going to have this robust appropriation of classical philosophy into Christian theology, and eventually this Christian mastery of classical philosophy. So if you're interested in the connection between classical philosophy and Christian theology, this book could be for you. Gregory of Tours writes the history of the Franks. There's a lot of hagiographical information, stories in it. Hagiographical meaning pious but legendary. So there's a lot of things that just blow my imagination if you look through that book, but it also has a lot of good historical information and will tell you about the very, very early years of France and the Frankish people. Gregory the Great, sometimes called the first pope, we'll talk about that more later. As the Roman Empire is crumbling into the 6th century, in the 6th century and into the 7th century, Gregory the Great is reestablishing civilization, and he's through the instrument of the church, and he writes this wonderful book called On the Pastoral Rule, or the Book of Pastoral Rule. You can find it under item L under the theological sources. Bede. Bede, B-E-D-E, that's going to be under the historical sources. He was a child oblate. That means he was given to a monastery as a child. In Jarrow in England, he's best known for his piece here on the bibliography, The Ecclesiastical History of the English People. It's a pretty long text, but if you're interested in English history, whether Christian history or secular history, this has a lot of information about the early days of English history. And some of the legends about King Arthur that still circulate are first found in this book. The Quran. I want you to have the opportunity to read the Quran at some point, so I smuggled it into this class as well. We will talk about Islam at some point along the way, and I want you to have the opportunity to read the Quran if this is the time for you to do that. Charlemagne, getting on now to the 9th century, I have 2 lives of Charlemagne under the historical sources, and let's see, that's going to be... Oops, I'm under the wrong book list. The 2 Lives of Charlemagne. Item D, Einhard and Notker the Stammerer, 2 Lives of Charlemagne. Again, a nice, lovely, inexpensive Penguin book. If you're interested in just reading some straightforward biography information about Charlemagne, this book is a nice, slim, and quite entertaining read. Anselm of Canterbury was the Archbishop of Canterbury until his death in 1109 AD, so we're moving on quickly into the medieval period. He's considered the founder of scholastic theology. He's known for his ontological argument, which for the existence of God, the ontological argument for the existence of God. He wrote Cur Deus Homo, Why Did God Become Man? And much of our modern theology, our Protestant evangelical theology on the atonement, stems directly back to Anselm. So if you're interested in either atonement theology or scholasticism, this is a great read. If you're interested in the Crusades, we have a couple books there for you too. Under historical sources, we have item F, History of the Expedition to Jerusalem. That's an eyewitness account of the First Crusade. We've got item G, Chronicles of the Crusades. That's basically an account of the Fourth Crusade, but you can read either of those if you wish, if you're interested in the Crusades. Peter Abelard. We have something juicy. Not enough romance in your life? Read this. The Letters of Abelard and Eloise. It's actually a great read. They have a tragic story. It's a love affair that wasn't meant to be. And there's trouble along the way, and they end up in separate convents. Well, a convent for Eloise and a monastery for Abelard, and they exchange letters, I think technically married at this time, but separated and living independently and having experienced this tragedy of being ripped apart and so on. So it's really a messed up situation, but, you know, it's better than, you couldn't think this up. So it's better than any other romance novel that you'd be reading this year. Abelard and Eloise, and I read it, enjoyed it. I'm sure you would as well. And it's a very, so Abelard was this brilliant logician in Paris. He makes a lot of innovations with the way philosophy. He's just a brilliant thinker, and he's a deep philosophical thinker, and he's a little bit too much for the old academy during his day. I can't understand Abelard. He's so far ahead of me, I just can't get what he's talking about. But this is a very approachable book because he's writing to his wife, and he's a very human character in this book. So if you want an approachable way to read Abelard, this is great. Bernard of Clairvaux, you can read some of his spiritual writings. That's going to be under the theological sources. Bernard of Clairvaux did so many different things, he's hard to characterize easily. He lived from 1090 to 1153. He preached during the Second Crusade. He preached against these violent anti-Jewish pogroms that were erupting at the time. He's asked by the Catholic authorities to promote the crusade and to stamp out to the best of his ability anti-Jewish violence. He's a person of peace, and he's also something of a mystic. So he's a broad character. But if you want to read about Bernard of Clairvaux, we've got a book there for you as well. Feeling entirely mystical, or having mystical experiences this semester from lack of sleep. Read Hildegard of Bingen. Pioneering German mystic and abbess. There's a film out, a German film out about her life too. It's a little bit esoteric. They take things in a little bit of a strange direction, but she's just a fascinating person. I think she was something of a mathematician and musician as well. So she's a little bit of a polymath, just an extraordinary person. Bonaventure, he is claimed, his name, Bonaventure, means good fortune, and this is a name that he takes after, according to tradition, he's healed of a childhood sickness by Francis of Assisi. Bonaventure studies at the University of Paris at the same time that Thomas Aquinas is there, and he writes a biography of Francis of Assisi, as well as a couple other mystical pieces. You can read his work under the theological sources under Bonaventure. So that's item J, the soul's journey into God. You can also read something of Thomas Aquinas. So are you aspiring to become a systematic theologian, or are you very interested in systematic theology for its own sake, etc.? Check out Thomas Aquinas. You're going to have to get to learn him at some point anyway. Thomas Aquinas is a Dominican priest. He died in 1274, so he's one of the last characters during the time span that we'll be covering in this class. He is the doctor of the Roman Catholic Church, the preeminent scholastic theologian, a brilliant logician and philosopher. Have you ever heard that joke about how theologians waste all their time arguing about how many angels can dance on the head of the pin? You know, you've heard that expression probably. Well, there's not that question in Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica. He doesn't actually try to deal with that question, but it's something that he might have tried to deal with. Yeah, Thomas Aquinas is just amazingly precise in his thinking and in his presentation of theology, and he's the preeminent scholastic theologian. Scholastic theology is really the last major movement within theology before we get to the Reformation, and so Thomas Aquinas is going to be the theologian that we close out this class with. Lastly, I wanted to put something in by my colleague and friend Brian Litfin. Brian Litfin teaches this class in Chicago, and he has an approachable book called Getting to Know the Church Fathers. So you can read his book there under the historical sources, item J, Getting to Know the Church Fathers, an Evangelical Introduction. What Litfin is doing in this book is he's following the tradition of patrologies, that is, a big, thick, dusty manual, early church history. It's an established genre of church history books that have been written at least for 150 years at this point. But Litfin had the great idea, let's do one of these books of this specific type, but let's make it approachable and relatively. Litfin's done. It's a good book, it's entertaining, it's informative, and it gets a lot of great information across. Any questions about the various books on the book list? And in a snapshot, you've seen many of we've touched on then, many of the characters and movements that we'll actually be dealing with in this class for the rest of the semester. Any questions? Go ahead, please. Was that a question? Anselm of Canterbury. And we've got his, an Oxford edition of his works there, Anselm under Theology. Yep, any other questions? Go ahead, please. You know, I think they are. They're not going to be hard to find. They're classics, so they won't be hard to find. I'd still encourage you to buy them because they're going to be inexpensive. Most of these books you can get for 15 bucks or something like that. They're not expensive books, and you're going to be working with it closely. So you'll want to mark it up, and you're going to write a review of it, which means you're going to want to work with it for an extended period of time. I just say pay the 15 bucks and get the book. But yes, they'll be easy to find. Any other questions? Okay, great. All right. Let me talk to you in the time that's remaining about historiography. How is it that we do history? I want to talk to you about some of the methods of history. Missed. Okay. I'm actually just interested, what is it like to work with that echo reverb? Okay. So when it comes around again, I'll try to grab it. It's like this mysterious bunny that keeps coming through our class. Catch it when you see it. Yeah. Should we name it? What is it called, class? I heard a nomination for the Inception sound. It's very different. It has a different spirit, doesn't it? It's not so jarring and loud. It's elusive. It's running away, hiding behind a tree. Anyway, historiography. Historiography, how do we do church history? Because I want to confess something to you early in this class. The way, not everybody does history the same way. History has this wonderful illusion of looking entirely objective. It's just the facts. And there's a lot of facts that go into history. But history is an art. It's constructed. It's an interpreted piece. If you've been to another culture, you know that history and national histories look very different from different people's perspectives. History is not really objective. So I want to take you behind the curtain just for the remainder of our time here, for the some minutes that we've got. I want to take you behind the stage curtain and just show you how this works a little bit, and specifically what I'll be trying to do in this class, the way that I want to do history. It's not just that I'm telling you that history is not really as objective as it seems because I want you to be suspicious and skeptical, but I actually want you to engage in the process of making history with me. I want you to become part of that historical process. You will be able to understand my intellectual project, the way that I want to do history. You'll understand that and engage that best if you know what I'm trying to do. So I want you to understand how history works just a little bit, and to think about some of the critical issues that go behind constructing history. What is historiography? First, let's just establish the term. What is it? Wonderful! Pete beat me to it. Historiography. Historiography is the study of history as a discipline. It is the study of how history is written. Correct. Thank you, Pete. History is the study of how history is written. It's not the history itself, it's the history of history books, if you will, or the history of the creation and writing of history. History works differely. Let me give you an example. If I were to ask you the question of this question, when did Christopher Columbus sail to the Americas? First sail to the Americas? How would you respond to that question? Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. Is that what I heard chanted? Yeah, good. That question, when did Christopher Columbus first sail to the Americas, has an objective answer. What happens if I ask the question this way? Maybe the same question, maybe not. When did Christopher Columbus discover the New World? How do you respond to that question? Is that the same question? What's changed? Go ahead, please. Yeah, we've got some loaded terms in there, don't we? What do you mean discover? Was Christopher Columbus the first European to be here? What about Eric the Red? Et cetera, et cetera. So when I say when did he discover the New World, what do you mean by discovery? And what pray tell do you mean by the New World? That sort of casts a certain sense of the political assumptions that I'm making behind the statement, isn't there? Those are two very different questions. When did Christopher Columbus sail to America? And when did Christopher Columbus discover the New World? Guess what? Any historical piece is going to have a spectrum of political assumptions, not just political assumptions, but there's going to be a set of assumptions behind any historical posture or statement. Now, one of the things that we do want to avoid is revisionist history. Okay, I'm giving you another term. What's revisionist history? Few people embrace the fact that they are doing revisionist history. Usually, historians accuse other historians of doing revisionist history. Few historians jump up and down and say, I want to do a revisionist history of this. Some do, but it's not that popular. What is revisionist history? What's revisionist history, class? Go ahead. Yes, I would just tweak that a little bit. I would say revisionist history is when a historian or an author of history is specifically trying to topple an established narrative. So they rewrite the history in a loud and brash way, a very outspoken rewriting of the historical narrative, because they're trying to topple an established historical narrative. So I've had it with all of the historians who are doing this, that, or the other with this historical narrative. I'm going to rewrite it. That is revisionist history. Usually that's a pejorative term. Most historians do not want to be caught creating revisionist histories. They want true histories. See, we're all struggling for this. There's this internal struggle in history that we want to be objective, and yet it never quite is objective. There is an art form to history. Can I try to, if in my reflections of the historian's craft, here's where I think the tension lies. Here's where I think that tension centers. History, if it's going to be useful to people, has to be a common story. A history of one is not really a history. You're in your own little world. History, to make it useful, is a common story. It's a rallying point. It's a narrative that a society or a people group can get behind and claim as theirs. This is, yes, our history. I identify with this. But at the same time as it tries to claim a group, it also has to speak to the individual. It has to be something that an individual can identify with. The history, a history that is so entirely general that it has no connecting point to the individual, isn't really interesting. History, if it's wonderful at that broad perspective and tells that larger story, is never useful to the individual if it doesn't actually connect to the individual. So it's both an individual story and a community story. And really, I think it's the tension lies, yes, in that community story and that individual story, but also it's a question of identity. A history is meant to cast an identity for individuals and communities. And that's always sticky. You can try to write a history that people identify with, but they have to ultimately identify with it. You can't force an identity on someone else. So here I am trying to give you, for example, let's just snap back to reality here in the moment. Maybe that'll help us make sense of the theoretics that I'm trying to get across. In this class, I'm going to be trying to present to you a history of Christianity. If you don't identify with it, if you don't buy it, then it's really going to be boring for you and really an almost useless class. Unless there's something about your faith and your life experience, these people that I'm going to be introducing you to. But how can I tellingly, I can't give you that identity. I can only present ideas. Ultimately, it has to be received. It has to be internalized if it's going to be meaningful to individuals. Continue to work with me. I want you to see behind the curtain how history works, and sometimes doesn't work. Even the way that we think about time can be different. Have you ever found yourself chatting with a Muslim friend, for example, and chatting about various historical time periods? If you talk about the Crusades, it's likely to be a difficult conversation. But if you start talking about what we would call medieval history, the things that play out in the 1200s, 1300s, how is your Muslim friend thinking about those events? Not only is his culture and his background prepared him to have a very, very different approach to the Crusades, but also your chronology for those events are going to be entirely different because he's working with a different calendar, isn't he? So when you talk about 1307, he's talking about 7-something or 6-something. I don't have the mathematics exactly right, but we're about 7 centuries off, 6 centuries off from one another. The Romans, how did they count years? Well, the Romans counted years from the founding of the city of Rome, which traditionally was 753. The calendar begins 1 AUC, AUC standing for Anno Urbis Conditiae, meaning the year of the founding of the city. That's how Romans kept track of time. How do we keep track of time here in the West? Well, from the time of the birth of Christ, right? The birth of Jesus. There's a lot of historiography involved here, isn't there? And guess what? There's no way around it. You can't actually come up with something that's entirely neutral or objective. It doesn't exist. It was in 525, what we call 525 AD, that a monk by the name of Dionysius Exiguus devised a system for counting years from the birth of Christ, the same Christian calendar that we have place in the West today. He used the calendar, Dionysius used the calendar to date the Easter celebration every year, And in preparing these Easter tables, he wanted to replace the dates that had been used under the system that Diocletian had set in place. So formerly, in these times, they were marking their dates with an Anno Diocletiane, which is in the year of Diocletian. This monk didn't want to use Diocletian as the point of reference in his chronology for the world and time, I should say. So he replaced that with Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord. Both are AD. It's a nice, convenient replacing. In the year of our Lord, and then did the mathematics to recalculate back off from the birth of Christ. It was in the time of Charlemagne in the 9th century that AD system, Anno Domini, has become standard practice. We can't escape historiography and the fact that our writing of history is not objective. Now, here's what we like to do, but I don't want you to participate in this blame game. It's very easy for people, and especially for historians who live in this field, to accuse other historians of having a corrupted or a somehow distorted historiography, always forgetting that everybody has a historiography at play. There's always a method for the writing of history. So embrace it. Don't just use this as a bludgeon to hit some other historical narrative. Realize that everyone has this historiography at play. Can I use perhaps a silly example, but one that I think will bring this home, make this very clear to you? I'll be right with you. How about the wedding video as a historical piece? Okay, I want you to see historiography at work. In every history, there's a historiography. A wedding video is a piece of history. What's the historiography behind it? So some of you over the summer were out at weddings here and there, and you found yourself after the wedding ceremony and the emotional charge of that ceremony. You find yourself now in a relaxed space, and they dim the lights. You've had good food, something good to drink, and now they're going to play the wedding video for you, right? And they'll turn on some lovely tear-jerking song, and they'll play pictures. Usually first of the groom, I don't know, maybe first of the bride, whatever, but first of one of these marriage partners, and they'll walk through up to about the year, 12, 13, 14, into their teens, and then they'll snap and see an infant of the other partner, and they'll follow this growth, and then at some point you start seeing pictures where both people are together in the picture, and things are getting more intensely romantic, and then finally you're seeing engagement photos and so on, and then boom, the lights go on, and you're in the present moment. They're now man and wife. That wedding video is a piece of history, isn't it? Of a sort. It's telling a historical story. Is there a historiography at play? Oh my goodness, yes. What was included in the video? What was not included in the video? Lots. This is not really an accurate historical record of these people's romantic lives, but it's very clearly the story of these two people. Yeah. So there's obviously in any historical record a historiography at play. You can see that. There was a question. Was it answered on Skype? Okay. Good. The Jews have their own calendar. I think they still use it. And I am under the understanding that it's meant to be from creation. I think that's right. So somebody Google that. You can verify it and put it on Skype. Go ahead. From the Exodus. Okay, so we have a nomination that the Jewish calendar actually counts from the Exodus. I frankly don't know. I thought it was from creation. I'm happy to be wrong. Somebody Google it, put it up on Skype. You can all check it there. Thank you. Thank you for that piece there. What is the historiography then that we're going to be using in this class? I would like to explore the historiography of world Christianity. World Christianity is, so for the remainder of my comments today, I'm going to be discussing what is world Christianity and why do I want to use world Christianity as a frame of reference to house this entire historical discussion that we're going to be having over the course of the semester. What is world Christianity? World Christianity is a relatively new idea in theological circles, and yet it's been very productive. It's been academically a very productive idea. It's only been around a decade or two, and yet there are entire centers, there are research institutions dedicated to this idea of world Christianity and researching what is world Christianity. The Center for the Study of Global Christianity at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, for example, is a perfect example of that. Or the Center for World Christianity at the African International University in Kenya. There are prestigious professorships dedicated to the study of world Christianity, like the D. Willis James Professor of Missions and World Christianity held by Alaman Sana at Yale University. Okay, so there's a lot of academic buzz about it in the last 2 decades. What is world Christianity, and why is it important that we understand it and even do history through the lens today of world Christianity? Well, world Christianity, in a nutshell, is the awareness that a large portion, even in fact the majority, the numerical majority of Christians around the world don't live in the West anymore. Now, I'm unapologetic that the title of this class is Christianity and Western Culture, because we live in the West, and it's appropriate for you, if you're in a Western institution of education, to know something about Western culture. That's a good thing. But fact remains, the majority of Christians around the world aren't living in the West. Where are they? They're in Africa, they're in Asia, they're in Central America. World Christianity is the realization that there has been this enormous demographic shift to what scholars will call the global South. Again, those regions, Asia, Africa, and South America. Although a lot of people are scratching their heads, why do they call that the global South? Isn't Asia just as north as any place else? Quiet. The global South, where Christianity has been exploding, what will that shift in demographics do to the future of Christian theology? That's the question in people's minds. And that's why people are studying Christianity in these academic circles. They want to know, okay, with this massive redistribution demographically of Christianity around the world, what is that going to do to Christianity in its institutional forms, in its theological forms, in its expressions of piety? There's just a lot of questions. And I'd like to explore as many of those questions as we can along the way in this class. There will be some opportunities to do that. Can I tell a story to illustrate this point, and then I'll give you some hard facts and figures about world Christianity. But first, let me just tell a story, because this mirrors the experience that I have had with world Christianity and kind of the wake-up experience for me too. So I'll share that experience that opened my eyes to world Christianity, and I intend for it to also be something of an eye-opening experience for you too. It was 2011. It was August, about this time of year, just before the beginning of classes started, and I was flying out to Nigeria to team teach a seminar in African Christianity, or ancient African Christianity. So Augustine of Hippo happened to be living on Augustine soil, on African soil, and he may have been African. His mother was a Berber. Clement of Alexandria, of course, Alexandria in Egypt is on African soil. So there's a number of these tremendous theologians in the early church who were all African. So I was flying out to Nigeria to teach a course on this, and here's a picture of the city of Lagos right before I arrived in it. What do you see here? What strikes you as you look at this photo? Say again, please. You see houses. I like the blue and red and orange and purple roofs. That's cool. That's creative. What do you notice? Just what's the first impression? It's a suburban neighborhood. Keep going. Looks like Spokane. Fine. Okay. What I thought was interesting is that here we are coming into a city that's larger than New York, and the roads, many of them, are dirt. Lagos, numerically, is larger than New York. Shot out the window as we're driving away from the airport, and I stayed at the ECUA guest house. ECUA originally stood for the Evangelical Church of West Africa. That denomination was a sister denomination to the denomination that I was affiliated with at the time in 2011, the Evangelical Church the Evangelical Free Church of America is a sister denomination to this Evangelical Church of West Africa. The church, however, no longer fits in West Africa, so they've kept the acronym because that's what people remember, but they've changed the name behind the acronym. Now the acronym stands for the Evangelical Church Winning All, because West Africa, it's grown far beyond West Africa. Here was my host, the brilliant Moses Owajaya, who was working, he's a Nigerian, he was working in Kenya at the time. We met the year previously when I was giving a seminar in Kenya at the Africa International University there. And on the way out, we were going to drive about 6 hours north of Lagos, up nearer to Jos, which is in the middle of the country. We weren't going to make it as far north as Jos, but we were headed about 6 hours north of Lagos. About 20 minutes out of the city, however, Moses signals to the driver to pull over to this site. There's something that he wants to show me. So here we are. We enter this church building. And I have to tell you that I lost sense of orientation in this building. It was perhaps the largest structure that I've ever been in. I know that I sound like I'm reporting some sort of alien encounter, but my sensibilities didn't quite work as I was entering this environment. And some of you will have seen me present these pictures elsewhere, perhaps at the mission conference. What is it that we're looking at? We're looking at a massive concrete and steel warehouse with a simple tin roof. I suppose that's a tin roof. Here we are looking up at the top of the roof. You can see that it's just apparently these slats of what I think is tin over top of these iron girders. And then about every block they have a pillar raising up to hold up the whole structure. Here at the front of the building we have what seemed to me to be an endless sea of white plastic chairs, the same kind that you might get at Home Depot. Now, I couldn't have told you how many chairs there were, but Moses, my host, told me that there were about 20,000 white chairs there. And up here in the front, you can see is the front of the stage where there would be a preacher preaching or the band would be playing. Here's a cross-section of the building. Again, it's very difficult to get perspective, but you can see that it's a large space. Here we are, oops, sorry, I'm headed the wrong way. Here we are looking at the front of the building, then looking back. And to me, this helped get some sort of sense of orientation. First of all, Moses is telling me, and I had seen from walking past them, that these iron pillars that go up from these concrete foundations are about a city block apart. So every one of those pillars there is about a city block. Now, do you see this? And you may not be able to see it because that projector is running just a little dim today. But do you see this square at the center of the screen? Do you see that? Do you know what that is? That's one of those massive outdoor TVs, the same kind that you might have if you were relaying like a very important sports event or something like that. And you can see these things for a long ways away because they're about 20 feet high. So about 5 blocks deep into the congregation, you have one of these relays. Can you see what this is? Probably not. That's another one of those massive outdoor TVs 5 blocks later after that. Can you see what this is? I'm sure you can't. It's another TV. It's about 4 TVs deep. Okay. And here we are on the outside of the building looking back, and it just wanders off into the mists. Now, so I've never seen anything or experienced anything like this, and in fact, this is a unique building. This is a one-of-a-kind. I didn't know it at the time, but I don't think there's anything like this elsewhere in the world. But Moses was explaining to me he had heard estimates as high as 10 million people can gather in this space. Moses didn't believe that. He said maybe 1 to 3 million people could gather in this space. It makes sense to me because we parked it about halfway deep in the building and it took 20 minutes to walk to the front. Moses was telling me that they'll run services. Now, this isn't actually a church building. This is a meeting place for an entire denomination. So Lagos, the city, has about 15 million people, and they have hundreds and hundreds of churches of this Christian Redeemer Church in this Lagos area. They told us that there was about 15,000 churches. The white chairs at the front of the auditorium are for the pastors of these churches. So they would have 20,000 pastors gather once a month with their congregations. Then the other back of the building, and I was told that when there was, so they would begin the meeting, say 7 o'clock the night of a Friday night, end of the month, and then that meeting would run all the way till about 5 o'clock the next morning. Moses related to me that when there's an altar call, it takes an hour for people to get to the front, so the band just plays an hour-long set while that takes place. And the logistics of it do kind of make sense to me, even though I've never experienced anything like that. And I've never been in an event of that size, so I have nothing to relate it to. I've been to Bloomsday. I love to run Bloomsday. This year I got my best time yet. Yeah, didn't break an hour, but tried hard. Bloomsday, there's like 50,000 people out there. That seems to me to be a big crowd, but we're talking somewhere between 20 and 60 times that crowd here at this building. Now, if you look up Redemption Camp Lagos, Nigeria, this is what you're going to find. Actually, they've built a new building here, I think. But here you can see the scale from the satellite image that, yeah, we're looking at something about 3,000 feet long, so a full kilometer in length, about 2/3 of a kilometer in its width. When I was in the building, it was more or less empty at the time. I couldn't see that this corner wasn't completed. I don't know what this is. But anyway, it's bigger than the clouds around it. That's all I have to say. See, it's a big building. Now, put that in your imagination. Why am I sharing this bizarre story with you? Because for my own sensibilities and my own experience, it shocked me into realizing that somewhere outside, off of my radar, in places of the world that I'd never been and didn't know anything about, there were churches that dwarf anything that I'd ever seen. It was just a shocking experience for me. Again, I think this is a unique building. It's not like every little country has one of these. But take that to heart, that the church outside of the West and the places that we know about is thriving. Numerically, it's huge. And that's what the study of world Christianity is. It's trying to understand, so what does that mean then for the future of Christianity? And what does that mean for the way that we tell the Christian story now? That's what I'm trying desperately to work into this class with the opportunities that I have. For the way that Christianity has grown and is expanding now, how does that change the way we tell the story about Christianity leading up to the present moment? It really demands an explanation, doesn't it? So I don't want to tell the story of Christianity as in, here were all the old facts the same way that it was told from the 1700s on, and then boom, suddenly there's billions of people around the world who, well, not billions, but over 1 billion people in the world. Yes, I think actually plural, I think 2-some billion people around the world that profess Christianity and have no link for how we got there. I want to trace the story of Christianity that explains as many of those facts as we can how we got there. And I've already told you that this is a growing academic discipline because no one knows how we got there. But let's try. Let me close off our time today by giving you just a couple of fast facts on the growth of Christianity around the world. And again, I've given you this visual picture of what the explosion of Christianity around the world looks like. Let me see if I can substantiate some of that with the best statistics that are available. These statistics that I'm going to be presenting to you come from the Atlas of Global Christianity, edited by Todd Johnson, and the book was published in 2009. By the way, you're all invited to come back Thursday morning if you want. We are having a class on global theology where we're going to be gathering about 80 guest experts from around the world to discuss the theological themes and the current trends in global theology around the world. And you don't have to be a student in that class to attend. You can watch it online through our YouTube broadcast, or you can just come in and join us in our studio audience. But Todd Johnson's going to be giving the first lecture. So he's the guy who, more than anybody else in the world, knows the statistics on global theology. On Thursday, he's going to beam in and talk to us about where do we stand now concerning the statistics of global theology. But these figures are from 2009. Oh, look who forgot to reformat his slide. Huh. Well, that's interesting. Anyway, what that says is in 1500 AD, right at the dawn of the Reformation, over 90% of Christians lived in the on the European continent. So it made sense to tell the story of Christianity in Western culture because the vast majority of Christians in the world up to that point in time were living in Europe. So the story made a lot of sense. By the year 2000, roughly 2/3 of the world's Christians were from what had been mission fields a century earlier. Now, that's a long period of time, but that's a pretty massive demographic shift. And I can personally rejoice. I find this statistic tremendous. Christianity in the West, numerically, technically, has continued to grow, at least up to the present point, although things are getting shaky. But this 2/3 of the world's Christians were from what had been mission fields a century earlier reflects massive growth outside of the West. That's good news. In 1910, over 80% of all Christians lived in Europe and Northern America. So between 1500 and 1910, you have some growth outside of the West, so to speak, if we speak of North American and the European continent as cumulatively as, quote, the West. You have some growth of Christianity outside of those boundaries, but humble growth. This last 100 years, though, has been an unbelievable growth of Christianity outside of the West. By 2010, this has fallen to less than 40%, again, based on massive growth outside of the West, not just, or I should say not atrophying of the numbers of Christians within the West, with the majority of Christians located in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. If that's the headline news of what's happened in Christian history over the last 100 years, how does that change the way that we process the whole story? Or here, Christianity in Africa. Take Africa as your paradigmatic example, and Christianity in Africa seems to have grown strongest, fastest over this last 100 years. In 1900, there were an estimated 10 million Christians in Africa. Now, that's estimated to be some 360 million strong, and voices who inform me, like Moses Awajaya, claim that that's far too small. He would like to see that number placed at about 400-some million Christians. So there is massive growth. That's 3,600% growth in the African continent of Christianity over 100 years. That's unbelievable. What do we do with this? How do we incorporate that into the larger story? David Livermore claims, with the unprecedented growth of Christianity, 7,000 new church leaders are needed daily to care for the growing church. What do you do in response to this massive growth of Christianity outside of the West? And lastly, I think this is the last piece that I have too. According to a report of the World Evangelical Alliance in 1999, Christian leaders from every non-Western nation say that their most pressing need is for theological education. Where does that place us today? So this is the story that I'm most interested in and will be working with as I develop the story of Christianity. The story of Christianity rises and falls. We're going to watch it engage in various cultures. First of all, we're going to see Christianity wedded to Judaism and Jewish culture. But what happens in 70 AD, scholars? You all were in New Testament class. What happens in 70 AD? The fall of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is sacked, and the temple is destroyed. Is Christianity going to fall with the fall of Jerusalem? No. Where does Christianity go? Where it spreads east. It spreads east as well as west. The book of Acts reports how the gospel spreads from Jerusalem to Rome. And there's this strong western direction of Christianity as well as eastern in the early church. Christianity, surprisingly, shockingly, becomes wrapped up in the Roman Empire. Now, for the early 100 years or two, even 3, the Roman Empire had been a persecutor of Christianity. It had been an enemy of Christianity. So isn't this a bizarre turn of events that Constantine in the 4th century converts to Christianity, and by the end of the 4th century, Christianity is going to be the official religion of the Roman Empire? How did that happen? I thought Rome was the sworn enemy of Christianity. Isn't Rome the Antichrist of the book of Revelation? What's going on there? How is it that Christianity becomes associated with Rome? What's happened? Well, guess what? The Roman Empire doesn't last forever either. Rome falls. Is Christianity done for? No. Christianity spreads through the Middle Ages largely in forms of monasticism. Monasticism is strong in places where the Roman Empire never was very strong. In England and Ireland, monasticism is perhaps at its very height, its very strength, and learning is preserved in these English and Irish monasteries. When Charlemagne finally begins to get some semblance of political order back on the European continent, where does he look for learning and academic resources? He turns to York up in England and brings down Alcuin and other English monks to help him reestablish learning on the European continent. Christendom begins to take form. It's a powerful institution. They've left us dozens of amazing cathedrals as monuments to the intellectual and political and economic force of Christendom in the late Middle Ages. But what happens then? Christendom begins to crumble. We have the rise of nationalism. And all of this mess comes out of the Reformation as well, and theological lines get redrawn. Is Christianity over? It's now divided more than it's ever been. Is that it? Is that close the curtain? Is the story done? No. Actually, surprisingly, out of this, I'm told now that we have 43,800 denominations in Protestantism. That's a lot of denominations. But one of the amazing things that came out of that is this missions movement after the Reformation. Is the disunity of the church going to sink it completely? Has God been taken blind? No, the Holy Spirit knew what was happening. One of the great things about having 43,000 denominations, especially if they believe that they're the only true church, is they're all out evangelizing the entire world. That's what happens with the missions movement. And you'd have this unbelievable tidal wave of missionaries going in all directions, which from all the figures of global Christianity, what they are today, looks like that missions movement was amazingly successful. Where are we in the current moment? Is the West flagging in power? Is there going to be some sort of toppling things? What's happening? The world feels very uncertain now. Whatever else happens at this stage, I know that God knows what's happening, and that Christianity is not falling with the various empires that continue to fall and will fall. We're going to watch Christianity grow and develop through all of these cultural associations. And I hope that that gives us a real sense of hope, too, that as much as we value a particular culture and identify with a particular culture, that God's plans are always bigger than our experiences, no matter what they may be. Good, but we'll cut the story for this semester off about the year 1300, so we'll only get half of the full picture. Okay. Pete, do we have any questions in on the Skype feed? Okay. Okay, we'll take the ontological argument a little bit later so that the class can follow that. Put that one up there for me, if you would. And Palmer, will you have a practice quiz to close out our time? Okay, we can get those things done in 3 minutes, I think. Great. Okay, I'll respond to this question just as soon as it's up. Great. World Christianity, here's the question that's come in on the Skype feed. So what does this concept of world Christianity mean for missions, whether it be for long or short term? I think it is phenomenally important for world missions. I think there's a change, a seismic shift, if you will, going on, a massive shift going on in world missions. And the short of that is that I believe that missions is not unidirectional. Missions is no longer, for example, a Western missionary going to the unchristianized, but since there are strong churches scattered through such a variety of geographical locations, mission, I think, has become much more of a collaborative effort, and I particularly think that there's a value in making those collaborative efforts educational. That's my read on what that means for missions. Talk to Dave Viney or Floyd Schneider if you want their view. They have the actual experience to back it up, but everybody agrees the arrival of world Christianity, its advent, means a whole new game for missions. Good. Thanks for that question. Palmer, you'll have the last word if you can dismiss people when you're done.
If everyone wants to get on Blackboard, if you're not there yet, we're going to take quiz 2. This one is also not graded. It's also just going to be 2 questions, but the questions are a little more like what they are going to be like in the future, versus the first ones were just over the syllabus. These ones are over actual content of the lecture. So if everyone's ready, we'll go ahead and go to question 1. The first question, according to the lecture, who is considered the father of church history? Is it A, St. Athanasius of Alexandria, B, Herodotus of Halicarnassus, C, Eusebius of Caesarea, D, St. Augustine of Hippo, or E, Dr. John McMath? Okay. Let me know if I'm going too fast, but we're going to go to question 2. I don't know how fast Blackboard is being for you guys. Question 2. According to the lecture, what is historiography? Is it A, pious writing about the lives of the saints, B, the study of how history is written, C, the graphing of historical events, D, historiography is not a word, or E, a theological term referring to God's plan of redemption throughout history?
Nicely done, Palmer.
Okay.
Yep. You'll catch the rhythm of what those questions will look like, and again, some of these questions will find their way back into the test banks for the actual exam experiences. Thanks so much for your time this morning and patience. I hope you're looking forward to this semester as much as I am. I'll hang around just a little bit if you have questions about anything, and just I'm happy to chat with you. Otherwise, thanks so much. We'll see you next week.